The year is 1753. The place is where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Great Ohio, in what is now Pittsburgh. It was a strategic prize beyond measure. Whoever controlled that spot controlled the river highways into the heart of the continent. The French, from their northern strongholds in Canada, saw it as the key to linking their vast territories, to locking the British colonists east of the Appalachian Mountains forever. The British colonists, for their part, felt the press of their own growing numbers, and their eyes looked west with a desperate, land-hungry gaze. The Ohio Company, a syndicate of Virginia speculators, had already received a royal grant for land there. And so, in the autumn of that year, a young, ambitious, and deeply unknown 21-year-old major from Virginia was sent on a perilous mission by Governor Dinwiddie. His name was George Washington. His task was to march into the wilderness, through the howling wind and the first flurries of snow, and deliver a message to the French commander. A message that was, in essence, a polite but firm eviction notice: get out. This land is ours. Imagine the scene. A young man, not yet the stoic figure of the dollar bill, but a raw, ambitious soul, leading a small party through the dark, leafless forests, the crunch of their boots on the frozen ground the only sound besides the wind. He finally reaches Fort Le Boeuf, where the French commander, a wily old veteran named Lagarde de Saint-Pierre, receives him with elaborate, courtly politeness. They dine. They drink toasts. And then, with equal politeness, Saint-Pierre reads Washington's letter and sends him back with a reply that was, in essence, "We will not go." The message was clear. Diplomacy had failed. Now, the forest would have the final word. The next spring, in 1754, Washington was sent back, not with a letter, but with a small force of colonial militia. Their mission, to defend a fort the Virginians were hurriedly building at those all-important forks. But they were too late. As they hacked their way through the wilderness, a French force descended on the forks, drove off the British builders, and raised their own flag over a much larger, much stronger structure they named Fort Duquesne. Washington pressed on. He was young, he was ambitious, and he was walking into a nightmare. He received word from his Native American ally, the Seneca leader Tanahurison, whom the British called the half-king, that a French party was lurking nearby. Believing them to be a scouting party sent to attack him, Washington decided to strike first. On the misty morning of May 28, in a dark, rocky glen we now call Jumonville Glen, Washington's men, guided by Tanahurison's warriors, surrounded a small French encampment. What happened next is one of the great, shrouded mysteries of this war. There was a volley. The French commander, Ensign Jumonville, was killed. The French survivors claimed Jumonville was on a diplomatic mission, a peaceful embassy to warn the British off, and that he was reading his summons when he was shot. Washington claimed it was a military reconnaissance. The truth, as it so often is, lies somewhere in the mist, obscured by fear and the chaos of that sudden, violent moment. But one thing is chillingly clear. As the firing died down, Tanahurison walked up to the wounded Jumonville, placed his hands on the Frenchman's head, and said, "Thou art not yet dead, my father." And then he sank his tomahawk into his skull, washing his hands in the man's brains. The young George Washington had not just fought a skirmish. He had started a war. And in the eyes of the French, he was an assassin. The name Jumonville would become a rallying cry for France. Washington fell back and threw up a hasty stockade he aptly named Fort Necessity. It was a terrible place for a fort, built in an open meadow, within easy musket shot of the surrounding, wooded hills. And there, in July, the French found him. In a cold, relentless downpour that soaked their gunpowder and turned the ground to mud, a superior French force surrounded the fort. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and with his men huddling in the rain, Washington was forced to surrender. The document he signed, in French, a language he did not read, contained a confession. He admitted to the assassination of Ensign Jumonville. He didn't know what he was signing. But the world would not forget. He was marched back to Virginia in disgrace. The world was on the precipice, and he had just given it a shove. News of these events took weeks to cross the Atlantic. When it arrived in London and Paris, the reaction was swift and terrible. The two greatest powers on earth began to move. In early 1755, General Edward Braddock, a tough, no-nonsense British commander, arrived in Virginia with 2 regiments of regulars, the red-coated backbone of the British Army. His mission was simple and direct, to march on Fort Duquesne, crush the French, and avenge Washington's defeat. Braddock's army was a magnificent, lumbering beast. He had his regulars, and he had colonial troops, including a now reinstalled Washington serving as a volunteer aide-de-camp. To build a road for his heavy cannon and wagons through the dense, trackless Allegheny Mountains was a feat of Hercules. It took them weeks to crawl forward. It was a column of power, a slow-moving dragon of empire, announcing its presence to every bird, every deer, and every pair of eyes watching from the forest. The French at Fort Duquesne were terrified. They were outnumbered. Their commander, Contrecoeur, was preparing to abandon the post or die in a final, glorious stand. But his Native American allies refused to fight a siege. And a bold young officer named Captain Daniel Leonard de Beaujeu had another idea. On the morning of July 9, 1755, as Braddock's army forded the Monongahela River, the music of their fifes and drums echoing in the summer air, they believed the worst was behind them. The river crossing was a success. The fort was just a few miles ahead. They formed up and began to march through the open forest. And then, the forest screamed. Beaujeu, painted like a warrior and wearing a silver gorget around his neck to show his rank, led about 900 French soldiers, Canadian militiamen, and Native American warriors in a sudden, devastating ambush. They didn't form lines. They melted behind trees, behind rocks, in the underbrush. The regular British soldiers, trained to fight in the open, to stand shoulder to shoulder and fire volleys on command, were utterly lost. They were cut down in droves, their bright red coats perfect targets against the green. They fired volleys into the empty woods, hitting nothing but leaves. Braddock, furious and courageous, had 5 horses shot from under him. He rallied his men, only to be struck by a bullet that pierced his arm and lodged in his lungs. Washington, riding through the chaos, had 2 horses shot out from under him, and his coat was pierced by 4 bullets. But he seemed to ride through the storm untouched. The native warriors, it was said, believed he was protected by a powerful spirit, and they aimed elsewhere. The British column broke. It was a panicked, bloody rout. Braddock, carried from the field, died a few days later. As the army fled, Washington, with his own trembling hands, dug the general's grave in the middle of the road they had built. They buried him in the road, and then marched the wagons and the survivors over the grave to hide it from the enemy who would surely desecrate it. It was a catastrophe. The frontier, from Virginia to Pennsylvania, lay wide open. The French, emboldened, unleashed their native allies on the undefended British settlements. This was the Indian War, part of the French and Indian War. For the next 2 years, it was a war of shadows and fire. Families huddled in fortified blockhouses. Farms were burned. People were scalped. The names of places like Kittanning became synonymous with terror. The British colonists were losing, and they were losing badly. But the world was not just a forest. It was also a sea. And on the other side of that sea, a man was rising. His name was William Pitt. He was a brilliant, mercurial, and, some said, slightly mad, statesman who understood the stakes. He saw that the war was not just about a fort in Pennsylvania, but about the future of the world. And he made a daring gamble. He told the American colonists, "Send us your men. We will pay for everything. And we will stop treating you like servants." He poured the full, terrifying might of the British Treasury and the Royal Navy into the war. This was no longer a colonial skirmish. This was the full weight of the British Empire. The first test of this new strategy came in 1758, at a massive fortress the French had built on the Atlantic coast of Canada, Louisbourg. It was the Gibraltar of the North, guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River, the highway to the heart of New France. A huge British fleet and army besieged it for months. It fell. The door to Canada was kicked open. That same year, a British force, this time a proper army, finally marched back to Fort Duquesne. This time, the French, abandoned by their allies and with their supply lines cut by the fall of Louisbourg, did not wait. They blew up the fort and retreated under the cover of darkness. When the British arrived, they found only smoldering ruins. They built their own fort on the spot and named it Fort Pitt, in honor of the great man in London. The city of Pittsburgh was born. But the decisive blow was yet to come. It was to fall on a city many thought was impossible to take, Quebec. The capital of New France was perched atop a seemingly unscalable cliff, the 300-foot promontory of Cape Diamond. The St. Lawrence River, swollen with spring ice and treacherous currents, was its moat. For 3 months in the summer of 1759, a British army under the young and aggressive General James Wolfe bombarded the city from the river below. The French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, a skilled and cautious veteran, sat safely behind his formidable walls, refusing to be drawn into a battle. He knew that as long as he held the city as the autumn storms approached, the British fleet would have to sail away, and New France would survive for another year. The summer faded. September came. The leaves began to turn. Wolfe grew desperate. He fell ill. He bombarded the city, but it did little good. He tried landing troops upriver and downriver, but was always repulsed. He was running out of time. And then, he saw it. A tiny, winding path, a farmer's track, snaking up the face of the cliff about 1.5 miles above the city, at a place called Lancefoulon. It was so steep and so narrow that Montcalm had left it guarded by only a small picket, believing it to be impassable for an army. On the night of September 12, 1759, Wolfe made his move. The mystery of that night is almost unbearable. The British fleet drifted silently down the St. Lawrence under a moonless, cloudy sky. Wolfe, it is said, recited Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard to his officers, and remarked, "I would rather have written those lines than take Quebec tomorrow." A sublime and terrifying moment. The first wave of British soldiers, in flat-bottomed boats, drifted toward the base of the cliff. A French sentry called out into the darkness, "Que vive? Who goes there?" A British officer, a Highlander named Fraser, answered in perfect French, "La France. Vive le roi." He said they were a supply convoy with food. The sentry, for a few precious seconds, was fooled. The boats slid past. The men landed. The path was found. The first man up, a volunteer named William Howe, scrambled up the sheer face, grabbing roots and rocks. He reached the top. The French picket was surprised and quickly silenced. And then, one by one, regiment after regiment, the entire British army scaled that cliff in the dark. By dawn, on the morning of September 13, 1759, General Wolfe stood on the plains of Abraham, a farmer's field just west of the city, with nearly 5,000 of his men drawn up in perfect battle lines. Montcalm was stunned. He had been outfoxed. He had to act, and act fast, before the British could dig in or bring up their cannon. He rushed his own army out of the city and formed them up on the plains. It was a desperate gamble. The two armies faced each other, the scarlet of Britain and the white of France, on that crisp September morning. For 10 terrible minutes, they stared at each other. Then, the French, their discipline faltering, began to advance, firing wildly and too soon. The British waited. They had been trained to do one thing perfectly. They waited until the French were a mere 40 yards away. Then, the order came. A single, devastating volley, like a thunderclap, tore through the French ranks. It was, an observer said, like the work of a great harvester mowing down wheat. The French line broke. The battle was over in 15 minutes. But both commanders lay dying. Montcalm, riding among his retreating men, was struck by grapeshot and carried into the city, where he died the next day. Wolfe, struck in the wrist, then the groin, and finally the chest, was carried to the rear. As he lay dying, he heard an officer cry, "They run. See how they run." The dying general was asked who was running. He roused himself, gave one last order, and then, with a sigh of relief, said, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." He was 32 years old. Quebec surrendered a few days later. The following year, 1760, Montreal, the last major French stronghold, fell. The war in North America was effectively over, though the fighting would drag on elsewhere in the world for 3 more years. The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763. France was kicked off the continent of North America. Britain took control of Canada and all the land east of the Mississippi River. Spain, which had joined the war on the side of France late and foolishly, lost Florida to the British but gained the vast, mysterious Louisiana territory from the French as compensation. The map of the world had been redrawn. It seemed like a moment of absolute, unassailable triumph for the British Empire. But here, my friends, is the deepest mystery of all. This victory, so total, contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The war had been monstrously expensive. Britain was saddled with a gigantic debt. And they looked to the American colonists, who they felt had benefited most from the war's outcome, to help pay for it. The colonists, however, saw things very differently. They had fought and bled alongside the British regulars. They had been looked down upon, treated as inferiors. They had gained confidence in their own abilities, their own militias, their own leaders, men like George Washington. And now, flush with victory, they looked west, to the lands they had just helped conquer. They were ready to pour over the mountains, to claim their reward. And that is when the British government, in London, did something astonishing. To avoid more wars with the powerful Native American tribes who were already rising up in a final, desperate conflict we now call Pontiac's Rebellion, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763. It drew a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and said to the colonists, "Thus far, and no farther. The land beyond this line is reserved for the native peoples. You may not settle there." Imagine the fury. The colonists had fought a war to win that land. Their young men had died in the snow at Lake George, in the mud at Fort Necessity, in the bloody woods on the Monongahela. And now, a king 3,000 miles away was telling them they could not have it. It was an act of breathtaking, arrogant folly. The war was over. But the peace was an illusion. The fire of the French and Indian War had burned away the old world. In its place, it left a new and volatile one. It left a continent divided by a line on a map. It left an American people with a newfound sense of their own identity and power. And it left them with a deep, simmering resentment against the very empire they had helped to create. The great mystery is not who won the French and Indian War. The great mystery is what that victory unleashed. It was the prologue. It was the shadow that fell across the next act. And the next act, my friends, was to be called the American Revolution. The man who had unwittingly started it all at a rocky glen called Jumonville, the man who had survived the slaughter on the Monongahela, George Washington, would be the one to lead it. The French and Indian War ended. But the story, the real, terrifying, and magnificent story, was only just beginning. Friends, if you are interested in the true history of the United States without embellishment, subscribe to the Empire of Freedom channel. Click on the bell so you don't miss anything.